The freighter had been watching for 10 minutes before he understood what he was seeing. A man crouched in the dirt beside a circular wall of grain sacks, tamping sand with the flat of a shovel while dust rose around his knees. The sacks were stained, mismatched. Flour next to burlap, next to feed cloth, and barbed wire poked between the courses like the ribs of something half buried. Behind the wall, in the shade of a wagon wheel, a girl sat barefoot on a flat stone, making chalk marks. She had not looked up once. The freighter counted the marks. There were hundreds. He looked at the man's hands and saw the cloth wrappings, brown with dried blood, and he looked at the girl's tin cup sitting untouched beside her hip, and he did not stop his wagon, but he did not look away either, because whatever this man was building, he was building it with everything he had left. Elias Marden reached Furnace Creek Wash in the second week of June, 1887, with a mule that limped and a daughter who had stopped asking where they were going. His partner, Amos Vell, had died 3 days before on the freight road east of Panamint, dropped mid-stride in the white afternoon heat, dead before his knees hit the ground. Amos had promised lumber. Amos had promised a split on the claim work. Now Amos was a mound of rocks beside a wagon rut, and Elias owed the balance on a claim he could not afford to prove and could not afford to lose. $11.40. One mule named Brindle, 2 picks, a shovel, a cracked stove lid, and a claim receipt that demanded $60 of assessment work before September. If he failed the assessment, he lost the claim. If he lost the claim, he lost the last collateral his dead wife's family had left him. He could not walk to Mojave. The freight wagon would not carry them without payment. And Ruthie, 10 years old, barefoot, standing in the shade of a wagon wheel with a tin cup she had stopped drinking from, had fainted twice since Panamint. The Wash was not a town. It was a scattering of canvas tents, 3 timber shacks, a depot run by a man named Lucian Pike, and a borax freight yard where 20 mule teams loaded for the 165-mile haul to the railhead near Mojave. Men came here to scratch silver claims in the hills or hire on with the borax works. Most of them lived under canvas. The ones with money, or the ones willing to owe Pike money, lived behind thin board walls that turned every afternoon into an oven. Elias set his camp against a dry bank on the east side of the Wash. The shelter was a patched canvas lean-to stretched between 2 stakes and the bank itself. It caught shade for 3 hours in the morning and none after noon. By midday, the stove lid, propped against a rock to reflect heat, burned his fingers when he reached for it. The air tasted like chalk. At night, the ground held the day's heat and gave it back until 2 or 3 in the morning, and even then the temperature barely dropped below 90. He rationed Ruthie's water, 1 cup before sunup, 1 at noon, 1 at dark. She drank the morning cup. She held the noon cup against her neck. She forgot the evening cup, and Elias found it sitting untouched beside her while she slept with her mouth open and her skin dry. On the 4th morning, Ruthie fainted, stepping out of the lean-to. Elias carried her to the shade of Pike's depot porch. A freighter's wife named Clara brought wet cloth. Pike watched from behind his counter and said nothing until Elias asked about lumber. "What do you need?" Pike said. "Walls, a roof, enough to keep her out of the sun." Pike pulled a pencil from behind his ear and scratched numbers on brown paper. 12 boards for a roof frame, 20 for walls. Canvas for shade gaps. Nails. Hinges. A barrel of water hauled from the spring. He slid the paper across the counter and tapped the total. $41. Elias had $11.40. Pike knew it. He had seen the claim receipt when Elias registered at the depot. "I can sell you 3 warped boards," Pike said. "That buys you shade for the door, not walls for your child." Pike was not cruel. He was exact. Freight from Mojave cost more per pound than the goods it carried. Every nail in the wash had traveled 165 miles by mule. Every board had been loaded, roped, sweated over, and priced to cover the teamster, the feed, the water, and Pike's margin. Lumber was not wood here. Lumber was distance made solid, and distance cost money Elias did not have. Elias bought the 3 boards. He carried them to the lean-to, propped one across the opening as a crude shade shelf, and sat in the dirt beside Ruthie with the other 2 across his knees. He had enough wood to build a door frame with no door, a lintel with no wall, a gesture toward shelter that would not survive the first real heat. The real heat had not come. June was a warning. July was the blade. Ira Chaffin arrived at Elias's camp on the 6th morning. Chaffin was 58, a teamster and camp foreman who had run mule strings through Death Valley since before the borax works opened. His face was the color of saddle leather left in the sun, and his hands were scarred from wire, harness buckles, and a mule bite that had taken the tip of his left ring finger. He did not introduce himself. He walked the camp the way a man walks a property he is appraising for demolition. He looked at the lean-to. He looked at the 3 warped boards. He looked at Ruthie sleeping on a folded blanket with her shoes beside her head because the ground was cooler than anything else she could touch. He looked at the stove lid, the 2 picks, the shovel, the mule standing hip-shot in what passed for shade behind the bank. Then he looked at Elias. "You have half a shelter," Chaffin said. "You have maybe a cord of brush if you cut every creosote in walking distance. You need 12 boards for a roof frame, 20 more for walls, canvas, nails, hinges, 3 barrels of water stacked before August, and a way to keep that child alive while you do all of it." He paused. "You have a mule, a daughter, and enough money to buy a door that will not close." Elias said nothing. Chaffin continued. "Timber, shade, water, and distance. Those 4 things decide who lives in this valley. You're short on the first 3 and too far from the 4th. "I cannot leave," Elias said. "I know." Chaffin looked at the claim receipt pinned under a rock on the stove lid. $60 of assessment work. If you walk, you lose the claim, you lose whatever Amos put in, and you owe the difference to whoever holds Amos's note. Pike holds Amos's note. Chaffin let out a breath through his teeth. Then Pike holds you. He turned and walked back toward the freight yard, without offering advice, help, or hope. He had stated the math. The math was the message. Elias was a dead man sitting upright, and Chaffin had seen enough dead men to know that charity only slowed the arithmetic. Elias sat with the math. $41 for a timber shelter he could not afford. $60 of assessment work on a claim that might pay nothing. A daughter whose body was shutting down in the heat. A mule that needed water he could barely spare. A partner buried beside a wagon rut. And a depot merchant who would advance him passage to Mojave, but only if Elias signed over the claim, the mule, and what was left of his dead wife's family stake. He would not sign. The claim was the last thing tethering him to the idea that he could provide for Ruthie. If he signed it away, he arrived in Mojave with a sick child, no money, no animal, and no proof he had ever been anything but a man who failed at everything he touched. So he stayed. And the question that kept him awake that night, lying on dirt that still held the day's heat at midnight, was not whether he would survive. It was whether the desert had given him anything at all that he could build with. The answer came from garbage. Behind Pike's depot, stacked against the back wall where the freight teams unloaded, there were sacks, dozens of them, canvas flour sacks, burlap grain sacks, cotton feed sacks, the empties left behind when supplies were broken down and distributed. Some were torn, Some were stained with borax dust or mule sweat. Most were whole, just empty, piled in the dirt because nobody hauled empty sacks 165 miles back to Mojave. Elias noticed them on the seventh morning while filling Brindle's water from the common trough behind the depot. He had walked past them 6 times without seeing them as anything but trash. On the seventh morning, Ruthie was with him, and she dropped a sack she had picked up to look at. She dropped it in the gravel beside the trough. The sack landed with a sound that was wrong, too heavy, too solid. She had dropped it into loose gravel, and the gravel had filled the open mouth. Elias picked it up. The sack weighed maybe 15 pounds with the gravel in it. He held it by the gathered neck and felt it settle, dense and compact. The cloth pulled tight around the fill. He set it on the ground. It did not roll. It sat flat, like a brick with soft edges. He stood there for a long time. The memory arrived without invitation. His father, a railroad-grade hand in Missouri, tamping ballast into a washed-out section of bed after 3 days of rain. Elias was 12, holding the lantern. His father shoveled gravel into a burlap sack, placed it in the gap, and struck it with a hand maul until the sack squared off and locked against the ones beside it. "Loose earth is nothing," his father said. "Give it nowhere to run, and it becomes the ground." Elias looked at the pile of sacks. He looked at the desert floor. Sand, gravel, rocky alluvium, the kind of material that was everywhere and cost nothing because no one wanted it. He looked at the gravel-filled sack sitting flat on the ground, like something placed there on purpose. He filled a second sack, then a third. He stacked 2 on top of 1, staggered, the way his father had stacked ballast bags in the railroad bed. They held. He pushed them. They shifted, but did not fall. He filled a 4th sack, placed it on top of the 2, and tamped it with the flat of the shovel. The stack compressed, the cloth pulled tight, the gravel locked. 4 sacks, 2 courses, a wall 1.5 feet high and maybe 18 inches thick. It was not a house. It was not even the beginning of a house. But it was the first solid thing Elias had built in the wash that did not require wood he could not buy. He sat down beside the stack and thought about heat. Every timber shack in the camp was the same. Thin boards, tar paper if the owner could afford it, gaps stuffed with rags. The sun hit the boards at dawn, and by noon the inside was hotter than the outside. The boards had no weight to them. They took the heat fast and gave it to the air inside fast. A man could fry bacon on the wall of Pike's depot at 2 in the afternoon. But the sacks were different. They were heavy, dense. The sand and gravel inside them had weight, and weight meant the heat would move through them slowly. Elias did not know the word for it, but he knew the principle from railroad work. A packed gravel bed held temperature longer than loose dirt. A stone building stayed cooler than a wooden one in summer and warmer in winter. Thick walls resisted change. They took the heat in slowly and gave it back slowly, and if a man could flush the stored heat out at night when the air cooled, the walls would start each morning almost fresh. He did not know if it would work. He knew it was the only thing the desert was offering him for free. Elias's first wall failed on the second day. He had laid sacks in a straight line, 4 feet high, tamped tight without any curve or batter. The straight wall had no way to push back against its own weight. By the 3rd course, the bottom sacks had begun to bulge outward. By the 4th course, the wall leaned like a drunk man reaching for a post. On the 2nd afternoon, when Elias placed a sack on the 5th course and tamped it, the whole structure shifted 6 inches toward the wash and froze there, trembling. Nell Tamson was watching. Nell ran the canvas boarding tent where freighters and miners paid 2 bits for a plate of beans, salt pork, and hard bread. She was 42, a widow who had come to the wash with her husband 3 years earlier and stayed after he died of a fever. She kept a cook boy, a tent, 2 Dutch ovens, and a reputation for honest portions and no nonsense. She had been bringing Ruthie broth every evening since the child fainted, not because she liked Elias, but because she could not watch a child go hungry. She stood 15 feet from the leaning wall with her arms crossed. "That is not a wall," Nell said. "That is a flower pile waiting to fall." "I know," Elias said. "Then why are you still stacking?" "Because I have to build something." "You are spending your body like money," Nell said. "When both are gone, that child will still need shade." She meant it as kindness. It landed like a verdict. Elias looked at his hands, already cracked at the knuckles from tamping, the skin on his palms peeling from the dry heat and the friction of burlap. He had been filling and stacking sacks for 2 days. He had eaten 1 meal. He had given Ruthie his evening water ration twice. Nell left the broth and walked back to her tent. Elias pulled the leaning wall apart, sack by sack, and sat in the rubble of his own failed idea. But he did not stop. The next morning he drove a stake into the ground and tied a rope to it. He walked 13 feet from the stake and scratched a circle in the dirt. The interior would be 13 feet across. The walls would be nearly 3 feet thick, which put the outer edge at 19 feet across. A circle, not a line. A circle could support itself. Every point in a circle pushed against every other point. There would be no long, unsupported span for the weight to exploit. He began again. This time, he laid the first course along the circle, sacks end to end, tamped flat, the curve tight enough that each sack pressed against its neighbors. The second course went on staggered, half a sack offset from the seams below, the way a mason lays brick. The wall rose evenly. It did not lean. Between the first and second courses, Elias stretched a strand of barbed wire, salvaged from a collapsed cattle fence a mile up the wash. The wire was rusted but intact. He had seen barbed wire on ranch fences hold against cattle and wind. Between sack courses, the barbs bit into the cloth above and below, locking the courses against sliding. Modern or not, the principle was ancient. Interlocking layers resist movement, and barbed wire was everywhere in the West by 1887, cheap enough to abandon when a fence went down. He predicted it would work. He said it to Ruthie, who sat in the morning shade of the lean-to watching him drag sacks. "The sand will take the heat slow," he said. "The boards take it fast and hand it inside. The sand holds it until night. Then we let the night pull it out." Ruthie said, "How do you know?" Elias said, "I do not know. I think." It was the most honest thing he said in the entire build. He was gambling his remaining strength, his remaining time, and his daughter's life on a principle he understood from feel and instinct, not from any book, any teacher, or any precedent he could name. The gossip reached Pike's counter by the 3rd day of the circular build. A miner named Orrin Kells told it first. "Martin is building himself a grave with handles on it." The phrase caught. By the end of the week, the camp had 3 names for Elias's project: the sand grave, the flour bin fort, and Pike's cheapest coffin. The last name carried an edge. It implied that Pike had driven Elias to madness by refusing him credit, and Pike did not like being named in another man's failure. The mockery was not unreasonable. Stand 20 feet away and look at what Elias was building, and you saw a circular stack of dirty grain sacks rising out of the desert floor, like something a child might pile behind a barn. The sacks were patched, stained, mismatched. Flour sacks next to grain sacks next to burlap feed sacks. Barbed wire stuck out between the courses like whiskers. Sand leaked from small tiers. The whole thing looked temporary, accidental, and doomed. The men who laughed had reasons. Loose sand does slump. Burlap rots in wet conditions. A thunderstorm, rare in the valley but documented and destructive when it came, could wash the base out in an hour. Mud erodes. Canvas tears. Nothing about the structure looked like it belonged in the same category as a wall. Lucian Pike made his position formal on the 10th day. He rode out to Elias's camp with Ira Chaffin and 2 miners who owed Pike store credit. The visit was not social. Pike had a business to protect. Every timber wall in the wash tied a man to Pike's depot, for boards, for nails, for tar paper, for the credit that paid for all of it. If a man could build shelter from garbage, Pike's leverage dissolved. He could not allow the idea to look viable, even for a moment. Pike dismounted and walked to the wall, which was now waist-high and closing around the circle. He kicked a half-filled sack near the base. Sand shifted, the sack dented. He looked at Elias. "A house made of dirt owes rent to the first rain," Pike said. Elias reached down and picked up the sack Pike had kicked. He tore the cloth open with his fingers. Inside, the compacted sand and gravel held its shape, a rough block, squared by tamping, dense enough that it did not crumble when the cloth fell away. He held it up so Pike and the 2 miners could see it. "It is not dirt," Elias said. "It is ground that has nowhere to run." He did not win the argument. Pike looked at the block, looked at the wall, and said, "When it falls, do not ask me for boards." He mounted and rode back to the depot. The 2 miners followed. Chaffin stayed a moment longer, looking at the barbed wire between courses. He said nothing, but his eyes tracked the way the wire bit into the sackcloth above and below, and something crossed his face that was not quite dismissal. That night, Elias found a roll of old wire beside his camp. No note, no name. Chaffin was not a man who endorsed experiments, but he was a man who knew that a falling wall killed fools and children the same, and wire between courses was better than none. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Elias filled sacks from dawn until the heat drove him under the lean-to, and then again from late afternoon until he could not see. Ruthie sat in the shade and counted sacks. She made marks on a flat stone with a piece of chalk she had carried from Panamint. 5 marks per row, rows grouped by 10. It was arithmetic, and it gave her something to measure besides the hours. Day 5. 180 sacks filled and laid. The wall stood knee-high around the full circle. Elias's shoulders ached from tamping, a deep burn that ran from the base of his neck to his elbows. He could not close his right hand fully in the morning until he worked it open against the shovel handle. The routine was brutal. Drag a sack to the gravel bank. Shovel fill. Tamp the sack with the flat of the shovel until it squared. Carry it to the wall, 15 pounds, 20 pounds, some closer to 30 when the gravel was dense. Set it in position along the curve. Tamp again. Stretch wire if he had enough. Go back for the next sack. Each sack took 4 to 6 minutes. Each course around the circle required roughly 65 sacks. There were 13 courses planned, plus partial courses for the window openings and the door. The total was somewhere near 1,000 sacks, and Elias did not let himself calculate the total hours because the number would have stopped him. Day 9, 390 sacks. The wall reached Ruthie's waist. She coughed from the dust, a dry hack that came every time the wind shifted and blew tamping grit across the camp. Elias wet a strip of cloth and tied it across her nose and mouth. She looked like a tiny bandit sitting on her stone, chalk in hand, counting. The heat climbed. June had been a warning. Now the days pressed past 105, 108. The lean-to was useless by 10 in the morning. Elias worked in the partial shade of the rising wall itself, moving around the circle to stay on the cool side. He ate once a day, salt pork and hard bread from the last of his provisions. Nell sent broth for Ruthie every evening. Elias did not ask for more. Day 14, 580 sacks. Elias's palms split open along the lines where the shovel handle pressed hardest. He wrapped them in strips torn from a ruined flour sack and kept working. The blood soaked through the cloth by mid-morning. By afternoon, the wrappings were stiff with dried blood and dust. At night, he soaked them off in his water ration, and Ruthie watched his hands with an expression that was not fear, but something older. The look of a child who understands that the adult keeping her alive is being consumed by the effort. The wall was chest high now. Inside the circle, for the first time, Elias could feel the difference. At noon, standing inside the unfinished ring, the air was not cool, but it was less. The thick walls threw shade across the interior. The sand inside them had not yet absorbed the full day's heat. It was perhaps 5 degrees different from the outside, maybe 7. Not enough to survive, but enough to feel, enough to believe. Day 17, 650 sacks. The first window frame went in, a rectangle of salvaged boards. Elias's original 3 warped purchases from Pike, fitted into a gap left in the courses and packed tight with tamped sacks on either side. The window faced east. A second window would face west. The openings were small, 2 feet across, 18 inches high, because every gap in the wall was a gap in the thermal protection. And then Pike made his move. On the morning of day 18, Elias walked to the depot for sacks and found the pile gone. Every empty sack behind the depot had been gathered, carried inside, and locked in Pike's storeroom. A miner who worked Pike's counter said Pike had declared the sacks depot property and was selling them at 4 cents each, 4 cents a sack. Elias needed at least 250 more sacks to finish the walls and begin the roof support. That was $10. He had $4.60 left after buying water and a pound of nails. He stood behind the depot where the pile had been and looked at the swept ground and the locked door and felt the desert close around him like a hand. Pike was not trying to kill him. Pike was trying to make him stop. A man who could not finish was a man who would come back to Pike's counter with his hand out, and Pike would be there with the credit ledger and the passage contract and the claim transfer form. Elias walked back to camp. He sat beside the wall and counted what he had. Roughly 700 sacks laid, 250 short. The wall was shoulder high but not finished. The door opening gaped. The second window was framed, but the courses above it were incomplete. The circle was close to closing, but not closed. And a gap in the wall was worse than no wall at all because it created a channel for hot wind to pour through. He was still sitting there when Nell Tamson walked up carrying a canvas bundle. "I heard Pike lock the sacks," she said. "He did." She dropped the bundle. Inside were 27 empty bean sacks from her cook tent. They were smaller than the grain and flour sacks, 2/3 the size maybe. They would need to be doubled up or filled thinner. But they were sacks, and they were free, and Nell had brought them without being asked. "I am not saying your wall will stand," Nell said. "I am saying that child needs something between her and the sun, and you are the only one building it." She walked away. Elias looked at the 27 sacks. He looked at the wall. He started filling. By day 21, 740 sacks laid. The first window frame set. The second window frame fitted on the opposite side. The wall was nearly head high in most sections, though 3 areas still needed 2 or 3 more courses. Inside the circle, in the shade of walls that were close to 7 feet tall in places, the air was still held, heavy, cooler than the blazing wash outside by a margin that Elias could no longer deny. He still needed sacks. He scavenged. He walked the wash collecting discarded cloth. torn canvas, feed bags dropped by freight teams, burlap scraps. He doubled thin cloth, sewed seams with a needle borrowed from Nell, and filled the improvised sacks with coarser gravel that packed tighter. They were ugly. They did not match. They held. Day 28, 930 sacks. The wall was closed except for the door opening, which faced north, the direction that received the least direct summer sun. The circle stood 7 feet at its highest point, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly inward, a ring of compressed sand and gravel, held together by cloth, wire, and tamping. It looked like nothing anyone in the wash had ever seen. It looked like a thing that should not stand. It stood. But the roof was open. The walls meant nothing without a roof, because the sun would pour straight down into the interior and turn the circle into a kiln. The walls could hold back horizontal heat. They could not stop vertical light. Elias needed timber for the roof. He had no money for timber. He had no timber. And the temperature was climbing toward July. The wall stood. The roof gaped. And every hour without cover was an hour closer to the killing heat that would decide whether the grain sack circle was a shelter, or, as the miners said, a grave with handles on it. Tomas Arbalo arrived the way most useful things arrived in the wash. Without announcement, and from a direction nobody was watching. He came on foot from the south, leading a burro loaded with 2 clay water jars and a roll of canvas. He was 61 years old, Sonoran born, with hands the color and texture of old adobe, and a frame that had been thick once but had dried down to wire and leather. He had worked freight roads as a swamper, repaired adobe walls at ranch stations from Tucson to the Amargosa, and hauled water for borax teams when the mule trains were short-handed. He knew mud the way teamsters knew mules, not from books, but from a lifetime of watching it crack, swell, hold, and fail. He stopped at Elias's camp on the 29th morning because the wall interested him, not the idea of it, the failure of it. He could see from 20 yards that the upper courses were beginning to lean inward, not catastrophically, not yet, but with the slow, patient tilt of a wall that would collapse in a week if no one corrected it. He watched Elias tamp a sack into the 4th to last course on the north side. He watched for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he walked to the wall, ran his hand along the outer face from base to top, and turned to Elias. "Your shovel," he said. Elias handed it over. Tomas did not explain what he was doing. He crouched at the base of the leaning section, cut into the packed earth beneath the first course with the edge of the blade, and widened the footing by 6 inches on the outside. Then he took a half-filled sack from the pile, packed it into the widened base, and tamped it until it locked against the existing foundation. The effect was immediate. The base was wider, the wall now sat on a broader shelf, and the lean chapitreux, which had come from the upper weight pushing the base outward, stopped. "A heavy wall must lean into itself," Tomas said. "If the base is narrow, the weight pushes out. If the base is wide, the weight pushes down." He did not ask if Elias wanted help. He picked up another sack and began filling it. Tomas's first lesson was foundation and drainage. He made Elias pull 6 sacks from the completed section nearest the wash bank and dig down to hardpan, the compacted layer of rock and mineral soil that sat 2 feet below the surface sand. When Elias hit hardpan, Tomas made him fill the trench with gravel, not sand. Gravel drained, sand held water. And water, Tomas said, was the one thing that could destroy a sand-filled wall faster than wind or age. Water does not need to visit often, Tomas said, only once. He explained through action, not lecture. He poured a cup of water on a compacted sand surface and watched it sit, pooling, soaking in slowly. Then he poured a cup on the gravel-filled trench and watched it vanish. The demonstration took 30 seconds. The lesson would save the cabin. Elias asked where Tomas had learned this. "Adobe," Tomas said. "Every adobe wall I ever fixed was killed from the bottom. Water wicks up. The mud softens. The wall sits down." He pressed his thumb into the gravel. "This does not wick. This sheds." They worked together for the rest of the day. Tomas did not talk much. When he did talk, it was about the wall, what it was doing, what it would do, what it needed. He was not charity. He had watched Elias work for 10 minutes and seen something that interested him, a man who was already doing the right thing badly. The circular layout was correct. The staggered courses were correct. The barbed wire was correct. The tamping was correct in principle, but wrong in execution. Tomas could see that Elias had the instinct, but not the craft, and Tomas was a man who could not watch good instinct fail for lack of a small correction. The second lesson came on the following day. Tomas watched Elias tamp a sack and stopped him. "You are hitting the edges first," Tomas said. "Hit the middle." Elias did not understand. Tomas took the shovel and struck the center of the sack 3 times, hard. The fill compressed, and the sack flattened from the middle outward, the cloth pulling tight against the gravel in a smooth, even surface. Then he tamped the edges. The sack sat flat and wide, like a thick tile. When Elias had tamped edges first, the sack had rolled, edges compressed, but the middle humped, creating an unstable seat for the next course. "Middle first, edges second," Tomas said. "The sack tells you what it wants to be. You have to listen." Elias tamped the next sack center first. It laid flat. He tamped 20 more that day, and each one sat better than anything he had placed in the previous 4 weeks. The third lesson was plaster, and it came with an argument. Elias had planned to coat the exterior with a mix of sand and water, a simple render that would protect the sackcloth from sun and wind. Tomas rejected it before Elias finished describing it. "Pure sand will not grip," Tomas said. "It will fall off in sheets." "What then?" Tomas walked a quarter-mile up the wash and came back with a bucket of reddish clay dug from a cut bank. He mixed the clay with ash from Nell's cook fire, handfuls of chopped creosote brush fiber, and water from his own supply. He worked the mix with his hands until it held together when squeezed and cracked cleanly when bent. Then he pressed a handful against the outer face of the wall and smoothed it with his palm. The plaster gripped. The brush fibers kept it from cracking as it dried. The ash hardened it. The clay gave it body. Within an hour, the test patch was dry to the touch and solid. A rough, reddish-brown surface that looked like poor adobe but held like something better. "Adobe is earth, water, and time," Tomas said. "Your wall is earth in a sack. The plaster is earth on a sack. They're cousins. They will talk to each other." Elias asked how long the plaster would last. "Until it rains," Tomas said. "Then you do it again. And if it rains hard, then you do it faster." It was not reassuring, but it was honest. Adobe and earthen plaster required maintenance. Every ranch station Tomas had worked at replastered after storms. The material was not permanent. It was renewable, cheap, available, and replaceable by anyone with hands and a bucket. The wall would need care, but care was free and lumber was not. They plastered the lower half of the exterior that week. Tomas worked one side, Elias worked the other, and Ruthie carried the bucket between them. The plaster smell, wet clay and ash and crushed brush, filled the camp, and for the first time the structure began to look like something intentional. Not beautiful, not finished, but deliberate. Progress markers from the outline, tracked through Ruthie's chalk marks on her stone. Day 30. The wall was closed, every gap filled, every course tamped, wire between every other course where supply allowed. 930 sacks in the circular wall. The door opening faced north, framed with the last of Elias's warped boards and 2 lengths of salvaged ore chute timber that Tomas had found in an abandoned prospect hole a mile east. Day 32. The second window frame set. Both windows were small, 2 feet across, 18 inches high, and placed on opposite sides of the circle, east and west. When both were open, air could cross the interior. When both were shuttered with canvas flaps, the cabin sealed. Day 35. Plaster covered the exterior from base to shoulder height. Above that, the sackcloth was still exposed. Tomas said to finish the plaster before roofing. Elias said there was no time. They compromised. Plaster the sunny sides first. Finish the shaded north face after the roof. The roof was the problem Elias had been dreading. A circular wall cannot hold a flat roof without a beam across the center, and a beam requires timber. Elias had no timber except the window and door frames. Tomas solved it with scavenging and geometry. They found 4 ore chute timbers from the same abandoned prospect. Rough pine, 8 to 10 feet long, none of them straight. Tomas laid them across the top of the wall in a radial pattern, like spokes in a wheel, with the butt ends resting on the wall and the tips meeting at a center point supported by a single vertical post set in the floor. The post was a creosote trunk, the thickest one they could find, stripped and tamped into a hole dug to hardpan. Over the timbers, they laid arrowweed matting, bundles of desert brush lashed tight with cord made from twisted yucca fiber. Over the matting, they stretched canvas, 2 sections of salvaged freight cover, patched and overlapping. Over the canvas, they spread mud plaster, and over the plaster, they piled a shallow cap of dry sand, 2 inches deep, raked even. The roof was not waterproof, it was not even particularly strong, but it was heavy, and heavy was what mattered. The sand cap would absorb the first hours of sun before the heat reached the canvas. The canvas would slow it further. The mud plaster would hold the canvas down. The arrowweed matting would insulate, and the timbers would carry it all without sagging as long as no one walked on the roof and no storm dumped weight it was not designed to bear. Tomas insisted on one more thing, a brush ramada, a shade structure extending 6 feet out from the west wall. 4 posts, arrowweed bundled across the top, the simplest possible construction. It looked like an afterthought. It was the most important part of the roof. The sun hits the west wall all afternoon, Tomas said. If the wall takes the sun directly, it stores too much. By midnight, the wall is still hot. The house never cools. Elias understood. The ramada shaded the west wall. The wall never received the worst of the afternoon sun. The thermal mass stayed cooler, which meant the interior stayed cooler, which meant the night air could flush the remaining warmth out through the open windows. Without the ramada, the walls would have become a trap, absorbing heat all day and releasing it all night, turning the cabin into a slow oven. With the ramada, the system had a chance. Ira Chaffin came back on day 37. He had not visited since the morning he walked the camp and delivered his verdict. He had left the wire. He had said nothing since. Now he stood outside the completed wall, plastered, roofed, the ramada casting its angular shadow across the west face. And he looked at it the way he looked at mule loads, calculating weight, estimating failure points, looking for the place it would break. "How thick?" he said. 3 feet at the base, Elias said. 2.5 at the top. "What is inside?" "Sand, gravel, river rock where I could find it." "How many sacks?" 930 in the wall, another 60 in the roof fill." Chaffin walked to the door and looked inside. The interior was dark. The floor was packed earth, swept. The two small windows threw rectangles of light on opposite walls. The air inside was still and noticeably cooler than the air outside. Not cold, not comfortable, but different, reduced. The heat in the wash was 106 that afternoon. Inside the cabin, the air felt closer to 90, maybe 88, maybe less. Without a thermometer, there was no way to be precise. But the difference was not imagined. It was physical. It was real. Chaffin stepped back outside. He put his hat back on and looked at Elias. "The real heat has not come," he said. "June heat is theater. July heat kills. August heat buries." He walked away. But he walked slower than the first time, and he looked back once before the trail curved toward the freight yard. Elias hung two thermometers. The first, Tomas provided, a glass tube in a tin frame, cracked at the base but readable, borrowed from a defunct freight station's inventory. The second, Elias traded his cracked stove lid for at Nell's boarding tent, where a miner had left it against an unpaid meal tab. He hung one outside under the Ramada shade and one inside, centered on the north wall at chest height. Day 40. Noon reading, outside 108 degrees in the shade. Inside, 81 degrees. Elias stared at the numbers. 27 degrees. 27 degrees of difference between the air outside the wall and the air inside it. The wall was working. The mass was absorbing the heat slowly, holding it, keeping the interior from climbing with the exterior. The roof sand cap was doing its work. The Ramada was shading the west wall. The small windows, shuttered with canvas during the day, kept the hot wind out. 81 degrees was not cool. 81 degrees in Missouri would have been a warm day, but 81 degrees inside a shelter when the desert was 108 outside was the difference between a child who could breathe and a child who could not. Ruthie sat on the packed floor and said, "It is like being in a cave." It was. The cabin had the same quality, dark, still, heavy-aired, insulated from the world outside by mass and earth. Elias sat beside her and felt, for the first time since Panamint, something that was not desperation. It was not hope. It was information. The wall was giving him information, and the information said, "This might work." Pike heard the numbers. A miner named Dodd, who had helped Elias carry or shoot timbers in exchange for a meal, told Pike that Marden's flour sack fort was reading 81 inside when the shade read 108 outside. Pike's response was immediate and public. He stood on his depot porch and told 3 teamsters, 81 degrees still kills when the water runs out. The man has a thermometer and a sand pile. He does not have a well. It was a good point. Water was the other equation. The cabin could moderate heat, but human bodies still sweated, still needed fluid, still failed when the water stopped. Elias's water came from the camp's common supply, a spring fed by runoff from the Panamint Range, piped to a wooden trough behind Pike's depot. Access to the trough was not guaranteed. Pike controlled the depot. Pike controlled the trough access. If Pike decided Elias's credit was exhausted, the water stopped. The noose was still there. It had just changed shape. Tomas coughed blood for the first time on day 41. He was mixing plaster for the upper north face, the last unfinished section of exterior. He turned away from the bucket, put his fist to his mouth, and coughed 3 times. When he opened his hand, there was red on his palm. He wiped it on his trousers and went back to mixing. Ruthie saw it. She was sitting 6 feet away, counting finished plaster sections with her chalk. She did not say anything. She looked at Tomas's hand, looked at the stain on his trouser leg, and went back to counting. But that night, lying beside Elias in the cabin for the first time, they had moved in on day 39. She said, "Tomas is sick." "He is old," Elias said. "Old men cough." "Not blood," Ruthie said. Elias said nothing. He had seen the blood too. He had chosen not to see it because Tomas was the only person in the wash who understood what they were building, and losing Tomas now, with the real heat still ahead, was a thought Elias could not hold in his mind without the rest of his plan collapsing around it. The heat built. Day 43, 110 in the shade. Day 45, 112. The wash contracted. Men stayed inside their shelters longer. The mule teams left earlier, at 3 and 4 in the morning, to cover miles before the sun reached full power. Nell Tamsen's boarding tent became a canvas furnace by noon. Her cook boy, a 14-year-old named Emmett, worked the stove at dawn and collapsed on a cot by 10. Nell served cold meals through the afternoon: hardtack, dried beef, water with vinegar. Inside Elias's cabin, the air was heavy but bearable. 83 degrees on the worst afternoon of the week, 30 degrees cooler than the shade outside. Ruthie breathed easier. Her color came back. She ate Nell's broth and asked for more. The cabin was proving itself in ordinary heat. The question that kept Elias awake was whether it would prove itself in extraordinary heat. 112 was punishing. 115 would be lethal for anyone without solid shelter or plentiful water. 120, which had been recorded in the valley, and which every old hand spoke of the way sailors spoke of rogue waves, would test every assumption Elias had made about sand, mass, and time. And there was one thing Elias had not yet tested: night flushing. The principle depended on opening the windows after dark, letting the cooler night air pull stored heat from the walls, resetting the cabin's temperature for the next day. But night air in June had barely dropped below 90. The walls were flushing some heat, but not enough to start fresh each morning. The interior crept up: 81 on day 40, 83 on day 45, 84 on day 47. The trend was slow but real. The walls were accumulating heat faster than the nights could pull it out. If the nights did not cool enough, the walls would become exactly what Pike predicted: a trap. A heavy, slow trap that would store the day's heat and add it to the next day's heat and the next, until the interior caught up with the exterior, and the only difference between the cabin and the open desert was that the cabin had no wind. Elias told Tomas. Tomas nodded. He had expected it. "In August," he said, "the nights will be hotter. Your walls will hold more. You must open everything after midnight and close everything at dawn. Every opening, every gap, and the door must face away from the afternoon. You built it north. Good. That was the right choice. But you will need to make the door itself." They had not built a door. The opening was covered with a canvas flap. Canvas breathed. A solid door, even a crude one, would seal better during the day and open wider at night. Elias built the door from the 2 remaining warped boards and a piece of ore-chute timber hung on hinges made from bent wire and strips of leather. It was ugly. It was solid enough to seal the opening when shut and swing wide when open. It was enough. The cabin was finished. Wall, roof, plaster, ramada, windows, door. 1,012 sacks of sand and gravel, compacted, wired, plastered, and standing in a circle in the desert floor like something out of a fever dream. Tomas looked at it from 20 paces on day 48 and said nothing for a long time. "It will work or it will not," Tomas said finally. "The desert does not argue. It tests." Stay with this story because the next hour decides whether the house is shelter, trap, or tomb. August arrived with a sound, not wind, not thunder, silence. The particular compressed silence of air so hot it stopped moving. Birds that had been present in June, sparrows, the occasional raven, disappeared. The flies slowed. The mule stood with her head down and her eyes half closed. The spring flow dropped. The trough behind Pike's depot showed waterline stains an inch below the brim, then 2 inches, then 3. Day 1 of the heat, 112 in the shade. Inside the cabin, 78 at noon. Elias felt relief, and the relief was a warning. Tomas had told him, the first day means nothing. The walls are cool from the night. Wait until the 3rd day, when the mass has taken 2 full days of heat and the night has not pulled enough back. Elias opened everything at midnight, both windows, the door. He propped the canvas flaps wide and felt the night air enter, warm, still over 90, but cooler than the walls. The walls radiated. He could feel it standing near them in the dark, a gentle exhalation of stored heat pushing out into the night. By dawn, the interior thermometer read 74. He shut everything. Canvas down. Door closed. The cabin sealed, and the day began. Day 2. 115 in the shade. The number Elias had feared since Pike first said it. 115 was not a temperature, it was a physical force. The air outside the cabin felt like opening an oven door. Breathing it was work. The lungs resisted. The skin dried between one step and the next. Sweat evaporated before it could bead. Inside the cabin at noon, 76 in the center, 80 near the roof where the hot air collected. The walls held. The thick sand absorbed the heat from outside, but the heat moved through 3 feet of compacted gravel and sand at a pace that could be measured in hours, not minutes. By the time the exterior heat reached the interior face of the wall, the sun had moved and the exterior was cooling. The wall was a buffer, a delay line, a slow clock that kept the inside running half a day behind the outside. But the problem arrived that afternoon. The night before had not pulled enough heat from the mass. The walls were starting the 2nd day warmer than they had started the first. 74 at dawn instead of 72. The accumulation Elias had feared. Tomas ordered every opening uncovered after midnight, not just the windows and door, the gaps in the upper plaster where the sackcloth showed, the ventilation hole they had left in the roof peak, everything that could admit air. The night of day 2, Elias lay on the packed floor with Ruthie and felt the heat leaving the walls in waves, pulsing out through every gap, the desert air carrying it away 1 degree at a time. By dawn, the thermometer read 73. It was working. But it was working at the margin, and the margin was thin. Nell Tamsen's boarding tent failed on the morning of day 2. The canvas, superheated by 10 hours of direct sun, radiated inward. The temperature inside the tent reached 109 by noon. Emmett, her cook boy, collapsed beside the stove. He did not faint the way Ruthie had fainted, a slow folding, a quiet descent. Emmett dropped as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He hit the ground face first and did not move. Nell dragged him into the shade of the tent's back wall and poured water on his neck. His pulse was fast and thin. His skin was dry. She could not get him to drink. She shouted for help, and 2 miners carried him to the trough, where they sat him in 2 inches of water and poured cupfuls over his head until he blinked and said something that was not words. Nell went to Elias's cabin that evening. She did not ask to come inside. She stood at the door and felt the air and said, "How?" "The wall holds the heat back," Elias said. "It takes it slow. By the time it gets through, the sun is down." Nell looked at the thermometer. 76. Outside the shade was still 107. She looked at the walls. Rough, plastered. The sack courses visible where the plaster had cracked, the barbed wire poking through in places. She looked at Ruthie, who was sitting on the floor drawing on a flat stone with her chalk. Emmett almost died today, Nell said. Bring him here tonight? Elias said. She did. Emmett slept on the packed floor beside Ruthie, and in the morning he stood up without help and asked for water. The cabin was 73 degrees. The shade outside was already climbing past 100. Day 3, 117 in the shade. The thermometer outside the Ramada read 117 at 2 in the afternoon, and Elias stopped looking at it because the number had passed beyond useful information into something closer to threat. 117 was not survivable for long in the open. A man working in direct sun at 117 would collapse in less than an hour. A child would collapse faster. A mule would stop and refuse to move. Inside the cabin at noon, 76. At 3 in the afternoon, the worst hour, 79. The walls were holding, but the accumulation was real. 3 days of heat building in the mass, nights pulling some out but not enough, and then the dust storm hit. It came from the south in the late afternoon, a brown wall of grit driven by wind that had been still for 2 days and now moved with the compressed energy of a held breath released. The wind was not cold. It was the same 117-degree air, now moving at 40 miles an hour and carrying half the desert floor with it. Elias sealed the cabin. Door shut, canvas down over both windows, every gap stuffed with cloth. The wind hit the walls, and the walls did not move. 930 sacks of sand and gravel, weighing close to 30,000 pounds, did not care about wind. The structure was too heavy, too low, too anchored to shift. The wind howled over the roof and sucked at the canvas and rattled the door, but the walls absorbed it the way they absorbed heat, slowly, patiently, without interest. But the dust sealed the window cloth. Fine grit packed into the weave of the canvas flaps until the cloth was opaque and airless. The cabin's ventilation stopped. The 2 small windows that allowed cross breeze were now plugged with dust-caked canvas. The door was sealed. The roof vent was buried under wind-driven sand. The interior began climbing. 76, 79, 82. The heat the walls had been absorbing for 3 days was now trapped inside with no way out. The cabin was becoming what Pike had predicted, a tomb. Ruthie's fever had returned. Bad water. The trough supply was gritty and low, and Elias suspected the pipe from the spring had picked up mineral contamination as the flow dropped. She lay on the floor with wet cloth on her forehead and breathed in shallow pulls. Elias needed clean water. Nell had clean boiled water in her tent. The tent was 80 yards across the wash in a dust storm at 117 degrees. Tomas went. He wrapped his face in cloth, put his hat on tight, and walked into the brown wind before Elias could stop him. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back with a covered jar of boiled water, he could not stand straight. He sat against the inside wall and coughed, not the single coughs of the last weeks, but a sustained rattling that brought blood to his lips and left him gray-faced and still. Elias gave Ruthie the water. She drank. He turned to Tomas. "You should not have gone," Elias said. "The child needed water," Tomas said. "I am old. I was going to die in this desert one way or another." He said it without drama. He said it the way he said everything about construction, as a fact about materials. His body was a material. It was wearing out. He had used it for the purpose that mattered. The dust storm lasted 3 more hours. Inside the sealed cabin, the temperature reached 85 degrees, the highest it had been since Elias started measuring. 85 was not deadly. 85 was a warm room in Missouri, but 85 was the trend line, and the trend line said that if the cabin could not breathe, the walls would hand their stored heat inward, and the advantage would disappear. Elias remembered Tomas's drainage lesson. Water finds a way. Give it a road. He looked at the sealed door and thought about air the same way. Air, like water, needed a road. If the windows were sealed by dust, he had to make a new road. He cut a narrow gap at the base of the door threshold, 3 inches high, running the full width of the door frame. He packed the edges with plaster to hold the shape. The gap was at floor level, facing north, shaded by the wall's own overhang. Hot air inside the cabin rose. It collected near the roof. If Elias opened the high rear window, the west-facing one sheltered by the ramada, the hot air would push out through the top while cooler shaded air crept in through the low threshold gap. He cleared the dust from the west window canvas with the back of his shovel, pulled the canvas aside, and waited. The air moved, not fast, not dramatically, but he felt it on his ankles first. A faint draw of air along the floor, coming through the threshold gap, moving across the packed earth toward the far wall. At the same time, he felt the heat near the roof shift, pushed by the entering air, drifting toward the open west window. The circulation was slow, but it was real. The cabin was breathing through 2 openings instead of none. Within an hour, the interior dropped from 85 to 82. By the time the dust storm passed and Elias could open everything, it was down to 79. The lesson had cost him 3 hours of rising panic, and it had cost Tomas a walk through a storm that left him coughing blood into his sleeve. But the cabin had survived the worst combination the desert could throw: extreme heat, dust, sealed ventilation, sick child, depleted reserves. On the evening of day 3, after the dust storm passed and the air settled into the terrible stillness of a desert night that would not cool below 95, a miner named Orrin Kells sat in his board shack on the far side of the wash and refused to leave. Kells had heard Elias's offer. Come to the cabin, bring water, wait out the heat inside walls that held 79 degrees when the shade held 117. Kells had heard it and refused because Orrin Kells would not hide in a pile of flour sacks, while other men endured timber walls like proper miners. His partner, a younger man named Raleigh, came to Elias's door at dusk. Raleigh was half carrying Kells, whose skin was the color of tallow and whose breathing sounded like paper tearing. They had spent the afternoon in the board shack. The interior had reached 108 degrees by 3 o'clock. The boards were thin. The tar paper had softened in the heat and stank of petroleum. There was no shade structure, no ventilation beyond a prop door, and no mast to slow the heat. The shack took the sun and handed it straight inside, minute by minute, degree by degree, until the air inside was within 10 degrees of the air outside and climbing. Kells had stopped sweating at 4 o'clock. His body had run out of water to give. When Raleigh found him, he was sitting upright on his cot with his eyes open and his hands on his knees, and he was not there. Present in body, but gone somewhere else, somewhere past heat into the dull, quiet place where the body stops fighting and starts shutting down. Elias and Tomas laid Kells on the floor. Ruthie, still feverish, brought wet cloth. Nell, who had come to the cabin at Elias's invitation that afternoon, poured small sips of boiled water between Kells's cracked lips. The cabin was 79 degrees. The floor was cooler than the air, packed earth shaded from the sun by 3 feet of sand and a roof, the coolest surface in the wash. Kells lay on it, and his body took the coolness like a sponge taking water. His breathing slowed. His color changed. By midnight, he was drinking on his own and cursing the heat with enough energy to be heard through both windows. Raleigh sat in the corner and stared at the walls. He reached out and touched the inner surface, rough plaster over sackcloth over 3 feet of packed sand. The wall was warm, but not hot. He pressed his palm flat against it and held it there. "It is like a root cellar," Raleigh said. "It is like a cave," Ruthie said from her blanket. It was like neither and both. It was a wall that had been given enough weight to think slowly, and in the desert, where everything happened fast, heat fast, cold fast, drought fast, flood fast, slow was the only thing that could save you. Ira Chaffin came inside on the morning of day 4. He had resisted. He had watched from the freight yard while Kells was carried in. He had watched Nell and Emmett cross the wash in the last light. He had watched Raleigh stumble through the door. He had not come himself because Ira Chaffin was a man who had survived 30 years in the desert by trusting timber, shade, water, and distance, and trusting a sand-filled grain sack was something his experience would not permit. But on the morning of day 4, when the shade thermometer read 114 before 8 o'clock and the mule teams refused to leave the freight yard, Chaffin walked across the wash to Elias's cabin and stepped inside. He stopped in the doorway. He stood still for a count of 5. Then he removed his hat. The thermometer on the north wall read 74 degrees. Midnight flushing had pulled the heat out after the dust storm. The walls had cooled through the night. The morning was starting clean, 74 degrees inside when 114 was already pressing against the walls from outside. Chaffin looked at the thermometer. He looked at the walls. He looked at the roof. He looked at Ruthie, who was eating broth on the floor. He looked at Tomas, who was lying against the east wall with a cloth over his mouth. He looked at Kells, who was sitting up and drinking. He looked at Elias. Chaffin did not apologize. He did not praise. He looked at the thermometer one more time and said, 74. 74, Elias said. Chaffin put his hat back on and walked outside. The heat hit him in the doorway like a wall. He stopped, turned, and said one more thing. "I was wrong about the wall." Then he added, in the voice of a man who needed Elias to understand the difference between one mistake and another, "I was not wrong about the desert. It will test it again." He walked back to the freight yard. The heat held for 4 more days. Inside the cabin, with night flushing and the threshold vent and the Ramada shade, the temperature never again rose above 81 degrees. Outside, the shade reached 119 on day 6. 119 degrees in the shade, and 79 degrees inside a circular wall of grain sacks filled with sand. Ruthie's fever broke on day 5. She drank clean water that Nell boiled in the cabin's doorway each morning. She slept on the packed floor and drew chalk marks on the wall, not counting sacks anymore, but drawing. A mule, a circle, a window with 2 rectangles of light crossing on the floor. Tomas did not get better, but he did not die. He lay against the east wall and watched the thermometer and said nothing, because the wall was saying everything he had spent his life learning about mud, shade, mass, and patience, and it was saying it louder than he ever could. The heat broke on the 9th day. The shade temperature dropped to $104, still brutal by any standard that was not Death Valley in August, but manageable, survivable, ordinary. Men came out of their shelters blinking and moving slowly, like animals emerging after a storm. The wash resumed its rhythms. The mule teams loaded. Pike opened his depot counter, and men began walking to Elias's cabin, not to mock it, not to kick its sacks, to stand inside it and feel the air and ask, very quietly, how it was done. The first man to ask was not a miner. He was a freighter named Dodd, the same Dodd who had helped Elias carry or shoot timbers weeks earlier in exchange for a meal. Dodd hauled water barrels for the borax teams and slept under his wagon because he could not afford Pike's lumber and would not take Pike's credit. He had survived the heat wave under canvas stretched between his wagon wheels, pouring water on the cloth every 2 hours to keep the evaporation pulling heat away. He had used 11 gallons of water in 4 days, just keeping himself alive. He could not afford to do it again. Dodd stood inside the cabin and pressed his hand against the wall, the same way Raleigh had, palm flat, fingers spread, feeling the temperature of the surface. "How many sacks?" he said. 1,000, give or take, Elias said. 930 in the wall, the rest in the roof. How wide? 3 feet at the base, a little less at the top. How long to build? 48 days, but I did not know what I was doing for the first 20. Dodd looked at the barbed wire showing through a crack in the plaster. Where did you get the wire? Abandoned cattle fence a mile east. There is more. And the sacks? Elias paused. Pike locked the depot sacks. I scavenged. Nell gave me 27. I sewed some from canvas scraps. Dodd nodded. He was not calculating whether the method was brilliant. He was calculating whether he could do it before the next heat wave. The answer, visible on his face, was uncertain but closer to yes than anything Pike's counter had ever offered him. 2 more men came that afternoon. A Chinese borax worker named Sung, who spoke little English but understood construction, walked the exterior tracing the courses with his finger and counting under his breath. A young teamster's wife named Ada Holt stood in the doorway for a full minute without entering, as though crossing the threshold meant admitting something she was not ready to admit. Elias answered every question. He drew the circle in the dust outside the door and walked them through it. The 13-foot interior, the 3-foot walls, the staggered courses, the wire between every other course, the gravel foundation trench, the plaster mix, the ramada, the night flushing routine. He did not simplify. He did not exaggerate. He told them what had worked, what had almost failed, and what he would do differently. The straight wall was a mistake, he said. The circle holds itself. If you build straight, you need buttresses, and buttresses need more sacks and more time. How many sacks for a smaller one? Dodd asked. 10-foot interior. Elias scratched numbers in the dust. Smaller circle, thinner walls, 2.5 feet instead of 3. Fewer courses if the ceiling was lower, maybe 600 sacks. 30 days if a man worked steady and had help with the roof. 30 days, Dodd said. The next heat wave could come in 20. Then start tomorrow, Elias said. Nell Tamsen did not ask about the method. She asked about the storeroom. She came to Elias on the second morning after the heat broke, while Tomas slept against the east wall and Ruthie drew chalk figures on the floor. Nell stood in the doorway. She still did not enter without being invited, a formality that Elias did not understand but respected, and said what she needed. Emmett almost died in my tent. The food spoils by noon. The water barrel grows things I cannot name. I need a cool room behind the cook tent, not to live in, to keep food and water from turning. I can build one, Elias said. I am not asking you to build one, Nell said. I am asking you to show me how. I will build it myself. Elias looked at her. Nell Tamsen weighed 120 pounds. Her arms were strong from lifting Dutch ovens and water buckets, but not from tamping sand into sacks and hauling them 30 feet. Building a storeroom, even a small one, 8 feet across, walls 2 feet thick, meant filling 400 sacks and laying them in courses, digging a gravel trench, mixing plaster, and roofing the structure. It was weeks of hard labor. You will need help, Elias said. Then teach me, and I will find help. She said it the way she said everything, without asking permission and without expecting charity. Nell Tamsen had kept a boarding tent alive in Death Valley for 3 years after her husband died. She had fed miners who did not pay. She had survived a heat wave that nearly killed her cook boy. She was not asking Elias for a storeroom. She was asking him for knowledge, which was the only currency she could afford and the only one Elias had in surplus. They started the next day. Elias marked the circle. 8 feet interior, 12 feet exterior, with 2-foot walls. Nell dug the gravel trench herself. She was slow but precise. By the second day, she had the trench to hard pan and filled with gravel, and she had recruited Emmett and a miner's wife named Clara to help fill sacks. Ruthie sat on a bucket beside the rising wall and taught Emmett how to tamp corners. She showed him the center-first method that Tomas had taught Elias, striking the middle of the sack with the flat of a board until it compressed, then working the edges. Emmett was 14 and strong enough to fill sacks, but not patient enough to tamp well. Ruthie, who had watched every sack of the 930 go into her father's wall, knew the rhythm by heart. "Hit it like you're angry at the middle," Ruthie told him. "Then be polite to the sides." Emmett laughed. It was the first time Ruthie had made anyone laugh since Panamint. The storeroom went up faster than the cabin. Nell had 3 workers instead of 1. The walls were thinner. The structure was smaller. And Elias, supervising from 20 feet away while he patched plaster on his own cabin, had already made every mistake once. He caught errors early, a course laid without staggering, a section of wire skipped, a plaster mix too sandy, and corrected them through Nell, who corrected them through Emmett and Clara, who corrected them through the work itself. By the 12th day, the storeroom stood, 8 feet across, 5.5 feet tall, roofed with arrowweed and canvas and sand. No windows. 1 low door facing east. The interior was dark and cool, cooler than the cabin because the storeroom had no openings to admit heat and no occupants to generate it. Nell hung her water barrel inside. The water stayed clean. She moved her dry stores, flour, beans, salt pork, dried beef, onto a raised platform of stacked sacks. The food lasted 3 days longer than it had in the tent. Nell stood inside the storeroom with her hand on the wall and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I owe you for this. You brought 27 bean sacks when Pike locked the depot," Elias said. "You brought Ruthie broth every night for 6 weeks. You owe me nothing." It was the truth, and Nell knew it, but she also knew that debts in the wash were not measured in sacks and broth. She had received something from Elias that had no price on Pike's counter, the ability to keep her business alive through the next heat wave without owing Pike a single cent for lumber. That debt, the one Pike would never collect, was the one that mattered. Lucian Pike understood what was happening before anyone said it aloud. 3 structures now stood in the wash that owed nothing to his depot: Elias's cabin, Nell's storeroom, and the foundation trench that Dodd had begun digging behind his wagon. 3 structures built from garbage, sand, wire, and labor. 3 structures that cost nothing to a man who controlled lumber, nails, canvas, and credit. Pike had built his position in the wash the way any frontier merchant built position, by being the only source of what people needed. Every board, every nail, every sheet of tar paper traveled 165 miles by mule from the railhead near Mojave. The cost of that freight was Pike's margin, and his margin was his power. A miner who needed shelter needed Pike. A miner who could build shelter from sand needed nobody. Pike came to Elias's cabin on the 4th day after the heat broke. He did not bring chaffin. He did not bring miners. He came alone, which was more dangerous than coming with an audience because it meant he was not performing. He was calculating. He stood outside the door and looked at the wall, plastered, cracked in places, the brush ramada throwing shade across the west face, the roof sand cap visible above the plaster line. He did not touch it. He did not go inside. He spoke from 10 feet away. "You are teaching poor men to cheat honest freight," Pike said. "I am teaching poor men to build shelter," Elias said, "with stolen materials." "The sacks were garbage. You threw them behind the depot." "I locked them in the depot. You scavenged others." "From the ground, from Nell, from torn canvas no one wanted." Pike stepped closer. His voice dropped, which was how Pike signaled threat, not louder but quieter, so the listener had to lean in and expose themselves to hear it. "Every miner in this wash owes me money," Pike said. "Every one of them. Amos owed me money. You owe me Amos's money. When you teach men to build for free, you teach them that debts do not matter. And when debts do not matter, this wash does not work." Elias said nothing. Pike was not wrong about the economics. The wash ran on credit. Pike advanced supplies against future claims. Miners worked their claims against Pike's credit. The cycle kept everyone fed, sheltered, and indebted. Elias's sand sack method did not break the cycle. Men still needed food, water, tools, and blasting powder, but it removed the largest single debt most miners carried, the cost of shelter. And shelter debt was Pike's best leverage, because a man who owed for his walls could not leave without losing them. "I am not telling men to stop buying from you," Elias said. "I am telling them they do not have to choose between your lumber and dying in the heat." Pike stared at him. The silence lasted long enough for the desert wind to shift and push grit across the space between them. "When the rain comes," Pike said, "and it will come. It comes every year, hard and fast, and once. Your walls will melt. Your plaster will wash. Your sacks will rot. And every man you taught to build cheap will come back to my counter with his hand out and his credit empty. I am a patient man, Martin. I can wait for rain." He turned and walked back to the depot. Elias watched him go and felt the truth of it settle in his chest. Pike was right about the rain. Mud plaster eroded. Sackcloth rotted if exposed to water. The method was vulnerable to the one thing the desert gave rarely but violently, a thunderstorm. And thunderstorms came to Death Valley. Not often, but once was enough. The question was not whether rain would come. The question was whether Elias could teach men to maintain their walls before it did. Tomas Arbalos spent his last weeks teaching Elias things he had not asked to learn. The relationship had changed after the heatwave. Before, Tomas was the teacher and Elias the student, the man who knew mud correcting the man who knew tamping. After the heatwave, after Tomas walked through a dust storm at 117 degrees to bring water for a child who was not his, after he lay against the east wall and coughed blood while the thermometer proved everything he had ever understood about mass and shade, after all of that, the relationship was no longer instruction. It was collaboration between a man who was building something and a man who was finishing something. Tomas showed Elias how to read clay. Not all clay was the same. The reddish clay from the cut bank a quarter-mile up the wash was good for plaster because it had low shrinkage. It cracked less when it dried. The gray clay from the wash bottom was good for nothing because it swelled when wet and shrank when dry and pulled the plaster apart from the inside. The yellow clay from the hillside above the abandoned cattle fence was the best of all, dense, smooth, low shrinkage, and abundant. But it required a mile walk each way with a loaded bucket. "You test clay the way you test a man," Tomas said. "Roll it in your palm. If it holds together, you can work with it. If it falls apart, walk away." He showed Elias how to pitch a roof for drainage. Not flat, flat pooled water. Not steep, steep wasted sand cap. A shallow slope, 2 inches of rise across the diameter, enough to move water toward a drip edge without exposing the canvas to wind lift. The pitch was invisible from the ground. It was the difference between a roof that survived a thunderstorm and a roof that held water until it collapsed. He showed Elias how to read cracks. A vertical crack in plaster meant the wall was settling. Normal, fixable with fresh plaster. A horizontal crack meant the courses were shifting, dangerous, requiring investigation. A crack that widened at the top meant the wall was leaning outward, critical, requiring bracing or dismantling of the upper courses. A crack that wept moisture meant water was inside the wall, catastrophic, requiring immediate action. "The wall talks," Tomas said. "You have to be patient enough to listen." They disagreed once, and the disagreement mattered. Elias wanted to build the next cabin, Dodd's cabin, with thinner walls, 2 feet instead of 3. Thinner walls meant fewer sacks, less labor, faster construction. The wash could not afford the time Elias's cabin had taken. Men needed shelter in weeks, not months. Thinner walls were the compromise that would make the method practical. Tomas refused. 2 feet is not enough mass, he said. The heat will come through by mid-afternoon. You will have a wall that delays, not a wall that holds. 3 feet takes 1,000 sacks, Elias said. Most men cannot fill 1,000 sacks. Then they build smaller, 10-foot interior, 8-foot interior, but 3 feet thick. A man cannot live in an 8-foot circle. A man cannot live in a 2-foot wall in August. The argument went back and forth for an hour, sitting on the floor of the cabin in the dim, cool air with the thermometer reading 76 on the wall. Tomas won, not because he was louder or more experienced, but because he was right and the thermometer proved it. 3 feet of mass was what held the heat back long enough for night flushing to work. 2 feet would store less heat but also release it faster, and the interior would climb past 90 before the sun went down. In a valley where the shade temperature reached 117, 90 inside was not survival. It was a slow failure. Elias conceded. Dodd's cabin would be 10 feet across with 3-foot walls. 600 sacks instead of 1,000, smaller but solid. "I do not build things that almost work," Tomas said. "Almost is what killed every adobe wall I ever had to fix." Tomas died on a Tuesday in late September, after a thunderstorm that arrived without warning in the afternoon. He was not building. He was not hauling. He was checking the drainage trench around Nell's storeroom, a task he had assigned himself because Nell's trench was too shallow on the south side and he had been meaning to deepen it for a week. The storm came fast, a dark line on the southern horizon, a wind shift, a drop in pressure that Elias felt in his ears, and then rain. Not much rain by any standard other than Death Valley's. 20 minutes of hard fall, enough to run across the hard pan and pool in every low spot and cut small channels in the alkali flats. Tomas deepened the trench in the rain. He worked for 15 minutes with the shovel, cutting the south side down to meet the gravel layer, and when he finished, he leaned the shovel against Nell's storeroom wall and sat down beside it. The rain stopped. The sun came back. Steam rose from the wet ground in thin white threads. Nell found him sitting against the wall with the shovel beside him and his hat on his knees. He was not breathing. His face was calm. His hands were covered in red mud from the trench. They buried him that evening on the east slope above the wash, where the morning sun hit first and the afternoon shadow came early. Elias dug the grave in hard pan and lined it with gravel, because Tomas would have wanted drainage, and because the act of digging and lining gave Elias's hand something to do while the rest of him broke. Ruthie placed a flat stone at the head of the grave. She had scratched something on it with her chalk, a circle with a small square inside it. The cabin, seen from above. It was the closest thing to a monument the wash could offer. Elias stood at the grave while the evening light turned the wash pink and gold, and the heat rose from the ground in visible waves. He did not speak. He did not cry. He pressed his palms together the way Tomas had pressed plaster against the wall, firmly, evenly, with attention, and held them there until the light was gone. There are moments in a life where everything that came before folds into a single silence, and everything that comes after grows from it. Tomas Arbalo had walked into a camp where a man was building the right thing badly, and he had stayed until the thing was built, and the man could build it alone. He had not done it for payment, friendship, or charity. He had done it because he could see correct instinct failing for lack of craft, and that was something he could not walk past. His last act was deepening a drainage trench for a woman's storeroom, and if that was not the architecture of a life worth living, Elias did not know what was. The thunderstorm had tested more than Tomas's body. It tested every wall in the wash. Elias's cabin held. The plaster on the south face softened, and 2 patches sloughed off, exposing the sackcloth beneath. The gravel trench Tomas had insisted on drained the runoff away from the base in minutes. The roof sand cap turned to mud, but the canvas beneath held the weight and the drainage pitch. Tomas's pitch, 2 inches of rise, moved the water off the edge before it could pool. The interior stayed dry. The walls stayed solid. Nell's storeroom held. The trench. Tomas had just deepened, drained the south side. The plaster lost a handprint-sized patch near the door. The food inside was dry. The water barrel was clean. Dodd's cabin, only half built, walls chest high, no roof, took damage. Rainwater pooled inside the open circle and softened the inner base of the lowest courses. 3 sacks on the south side slumped. The wire held the courses above them in place, but the gap was visible and the wall would need repair before it could continue upward. Pike's lumber shed flooded. He had stacked boards across the natural drainage path behind the depot, and when the runoff came, a sheet of brown water 2 inches deep moving fast down the wash, it hit the lumber pile, pooled behind it, soaked the lower boards, and warped them. His tar paper, stored loose under an overhang, blew into the mud. His credit ledger, kept in a tin box on a shelf, survived, but 2 crates of nails rusted in the damp before Pike could move them inside. The irony was visible to everyone in the wash. The man who sold lumber to keep others dependent had lost lumber to the rain. The man who predicted rain would destroy the sand walls was rebuilding his own shed while the sand walls stood. Elias did not point it out. He did not need to. Nell pointed it out for him, standing on the depot porch where Pike could hear her, speaking to Clara about the storeroom. "Every sack of beans I own is dry this morning. How are your nails, Lucian?" Pike said nothing, but his jaw worked, and the tendons in his neck stood out, and Elias, watching from across the wash, understood that Pike's silence was more dangerous than his words. Elias repaired Dodd's wall the next morning. He pulled the 3 slumped sacks, repacked them with fresh gravel, tamped them tight, and relayed the wire. Then he dug the drainage trench that Dodd had skipped. Dodd had been in a hurry trying to finish before the next heat wave and had laid the first course directly on surface sand. "The trench is the first thing," Elias said. "Not the last, not when you get to it. The first." Dodd took the lesson. He dug the trench to hardpan and filled it with gravel, and Elias waited until he was done before allowing another sack to go up. The repair took 2 days. When Dodd's wall was rising again, Elias turned to the cabin's exterior, the patches where plaster had sloughed, and reapplied Tomas's mix: red clay, ash, chopped brush fiber, water. He worked it with his hands the way Tomas had taught him, pressing and smoothing until the plaster gripped the sackcloth and the surface was continuous again. He worked alone. Tomas was gone. The corrections were Elias's now. Every decision about clay mix, plaster thickness, crack interpretation, drainage depth. He made them the way Tomas had taught, by touching the wall, reading what it said, and responding with material instead of guesswork. CTA. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. 2 days after the storm, Sung, the Chinese borax worker, came to Elias with a piece of torn canvas and a question. He did not speak enough English for the question to be verbal. He drew it in the dirt, a circle with thick walls, a low door, 2 windows. He pointed at himself and at a man standing behind him, another borax worker named Chen, older, with a limp. "For you?" Elias said. Sung nodded. "Both of you." Sung held up 2 fingers. Then he held up a third. "3 people?" Sung nodded again. He drew a smaller figure beside the circle, a child perhaps, or a smaller person, someone who needed shelter and could not build it alone. "Show me where," Elias said. Sung led him to a flat spot behind the borax works where 3 Chinese workers had been sleeping under a shared canvas sheet propped on poles. The ground was hardpan with a thin layer of sand, perfect for a foundation trench. There was gravel 50 yards away in a dry creek cut. The spot was sheltered from the worst western sun by the borax works timber frame. Elias marked a circle, 11 feet interior, 3-foot walls, smaller than his cabin, larger than Nell's storeroom, room for 3 people to sleep and sit and breathe through the worst heat. He estimated 700 sacks and a crew of 3 working every hour the sun allowed. Sung began filling sacks that afternoon. Chen, despite the limp, dug the gravel trench. The third person turned out to be Chen's wife, a woman named May, who tamped sacks with a flat board and a force that surprised Elias until he watched her hands and saw the calluses of someone who had worked crushing ore at a stamp mill. Elias supervised. He walked the circle each morning, checked the courses, tested the tamp, examined the wire placement. He corrected mistakes, a gap where 2 sacks met without overlap, a section where the wire was laid too loose, a course where the stagger had drifted, and 3 seams aligned vertically. But the corrections were fewer each day. Sung was careful. May was precise. Chen, despite the limp, had the patience of a man who understood that a wall was only as strong as the worst sack in it. Ada Holt, the young teamster's wife, came to watch on the 5th day. She stood at the edge of the circle with her arms folded across her chest and watched May tamp sacks for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she turned to Elias. My husband says it is a waste," she said. "He says timber is the only wall that holds." "Your husband was inside my cabin during the heat," Elias said. "Ask him what the thermometer read." Ada's arms tightened across her chest. She did not respond. She watched for 10 more minutes and walked back to the teamster's camp. The next morning, she returned with a shovel and began digging a gravel trench beside the borax workers' circle without asking permission or explaining herself. By the end of September, the wash held 4 sand sack structures in various stages of completion. Elias's cabin, the original, stood with patched plaster and a brush ramada that creaked in the wind but held. Nell's storeroom operated daily, keeping food cool and water clean. Dodd's cabin was roofed and plastered, smaller than Elias's, but solid now. Dodd slept inside for the first time, on a night when the temperature still held above 100 in the open. Sung and Chen's cabin was wall complete and waiting for a roof. Not every wall was perfect. Dodd's plaster had been mixed with too much sand, and cracked badly on the east face within a week. Elias showed him how to replaster with the correct clay ash fiber mix. One section of Sung's wall had been tamped unevenly, and the upper course tilted inward. Elias made them remove 3 sacks, retamp the lower course, and relay. The correction took half a day. Sung accepted it without argument. These failures mattered. They kept the story honest. A method that never failed was a fairy tale. A method that failed in specific, fixable ways was a craft. Elias taught the difference between a crack that needed plaster and a crack that needed structural repair, between a lean that could be shimmed and a lean that required courses removed, between a plaster that had dried too fast and a plaster that had been mixed wrong. He taught by rule. Build in a circle, 3 feet thick, gravel trench to hard pan. Wire between every other course, center tamp first, plaster with clay, ash, and fiber, shade the west wall, open at night, close at dawn, replaster after rain. He taught by principle. The wall holds heat because it is heavy. The heavier the wall, the slower the heat. The slower the heat, the more time the night has to pull it back. If you understand the principle, you can adapt the method. If you only know the rule, you are lost the first time something changes. And he taught by refusal. When a miner named Garrett asked Elias to build him a cabin while Garrett watched, Elias said no. A wall you do not understand will betray you, Elias said. If you do not know what the cracks mean, you will not fix them. If you do not fix them, the wall falls. And when the wall falls, you will blame the sacks instead of yourself. Garrett built his own cabin. Elias supervised. The cabin was ugly. The plaster was uneven. The door hung crooked. But Garrett understood every sack in it because his hands had filled and tamped and placed every one, and when a crack appeared on the south face after the next windstorm, Garrett fixed it before Elias had even seen it. Pike's patience ended in October, but it did not end the way Pike had planned. He had waited for the thunderstorm to destroy the sand walls. The storm had come, and the walls had held, and his lumber had warped. He had waited for the plaster to fail. The plaster had cracked and been repaired within days. He had waited for the men to grow tired of maintenance and come back to his counter. The men maintained their walls because the alternative was heat that killed. What Pike had not anticipated was the flood. The second storm came on the 14th of October, larger than the first, a proper desert thunderstorm that dropped water for 40 minutes and sent a flash flood down the wash. Flash floods in Death Valley were documented events, sudden, violent, short-lived, capable of moving boulders and drowning men who were standing on dry ground 5 minutes earlier. The water came down the wash at knee height. It hit Pike's depot and split around it. Versatile, the depot was timber on a raised platform, built by men who understood wash dynamics. But Pike's lumber shed was not on a platform. It was on the wash floor, and Pike had restacked his boards across the same drainage path he had blocked before because the path was flat, and his boards were heavy, and he was Lucian Pike, who had survived 30 years in this valley by being right about everything except the one thing he was wrong about. The flood carried 40 boards out of the shed and deposited them 200 yards down the wash in a tangle of mud and creosote brush. It soaked his remaining stock. It undermined one corner of the shed itself, which tilted and dropped 6 inches into the softened ground. Elias's cabin took the flood differently. The gravel trench drained. The walls, sitting on hardpan with a gravel buffer, shed the water at the base. The plaster softened on the lowest foot of the south face, but held everywhere else. The door, facing north and up slope from the wash center, never saw water. The interior stayed dry, but Dodd's cabin, lower in the wash, took water against the base. Elias was there in 20 minutes, cutting diversion channels with a shovel, directing Dodd and Raleigh to stack rocks against the south face as a deflection berm. They worked in the rain, in the mud, with water running past their ankles, and when the flood receded, the cabin stood. 3 sacks on the lowest course had softened where the water had pooled against unprotected cloth. Elias cut them out and replaced them with fresh sacks packed with gravel, and he plastered the base with an extra thick coat of clay that Tomas would have approved of. Sung and Chen's cabin, still unroofed, filled with 2 inches of water. May scooped it out with a bucket while Chen and Sung cut channels around the base. The walls held. The wire held. The courses did not shift. 2 inches of standing water was not enough to wick through 3 feet of compacted sand and gravel. The wall was too dense, too heavy, too tightly packed to absorb water the way loose earth would have. Elias stood in the wash after the flood receded, mud to his shins, and felt Tomas's absence like a missing hand. Every decision he had just made, the diversion channels, the deflection berm, the replacement sacks, the thick plaster coat, was a decision Tomas had prepared him for. The drainage lesson, the crack reading lesson, the plaster lesson, the argument about wall thickness. Every conversation, every demonstration, every disagreement had been a tool placed in Elias's hand for a moment Tomas would not be present to witness. Do not fight water, give it a road. He had given it a road. The road had worked, and the man who had taught him to build roads was in a gravel-lined grave on the east slope, because even Tomas could not build a drainage trench for his own lungs. The flood did what the heat wave could not. It brought Pike to Elias's door, not as a friend, not as a convert, as a man whose flour was wet. Pike's depot had survived the flood structurally, but the lower shelves had taken water. 2 barrels of flour were soaked through. A crate of sugar had dissolved into the boards beneath it. His record books, the credit ledgers, the freight manifests, the claim debt accounts, were in a tin box that had stayed dry, but the box had been on a shelf that was now warped, and Pike was a man who understood that a warped shelf today was a collapsed shelf tomorrow. The only dry storage in the wash was Nell's storeroom. The sand-sack walls had kept the interior dry through both storms. The gravel trench had drained every drop. The food inside was untouched. The water barrel was clean. Pike came to Elias's cabin at dusk on the day after the flood. He stood outside the door, exactly where he had stood months ago when he had said a house made of dirt owed rent to the first rain. The rent had come due. The house had paid it. "What would it cost," Pike said, "to put one of those walls around my flour?" The words cost Pike more than any freight bill he had ever paid. Every syllable was a concession. Not to Elias, to the material, to the sand, the gravel, the sackcloth, the barbed wire, the plaster, to the idea that a man with nothing could build something that a man with everything could not buy. Elias looked at Pike for a long moment. He thought about Amos, dead on the freight road. He thought about $11.40. He thought about Pike locking the sacks, Pike riding out to kick his wall, Pike calling the cabin a grave, Pike threatening his credit, Pike warning miners not to help. He thought about all of it, and then he set it down the way a man sets down a heavy sack at the end of a long carry. "Work," Elias said. Pike's jaw tightened. "How much work?" "The same as everyone else. You dig the trench, you fill the sacks, you tamp them, you lay the wire, you mix the plaster. I will show you how. I will not do it for you." "I am not a laborer," Pike said. "You are a man whose flour is wet," Elias said, "and I am a man who can teach you to keep it dry. The price is your hands and your time. That is all it has ever cost anyone." Pike stared at him. The silence between them was the weight of every word Pike had said since June, every dismissal, every threat, every prediction of collapse. The silence held all of it, and when Pike finally spoke, his voice was flat and stripped of the quiet menace he had carried all summer. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning. Bring a shovel." Pike turned and walked back to the depot. He did not look back, but Elias, watching him cross the wash in the last light, saw something in Pike's posture that was not defeat. It was the rigid carriage of a man walking toward a task he had spent months insisting was beneath him, knowing that every miner in the wash would see him digging a trench and filling grain sacks with sand. Pike would build, and the building would cost him more than $41 ever could. Pike dug his trench on a Wednesday morning while 6 miners watched from the freight yard fence. He arrived at dawn with a shovel he had taken from his own depot stock. A new shovel, because Lucian Pike would not borrow a tool from the man he had spent 4 months trying to break. He wore his usual clothes, pressed shirt, vest, boots that had never touched a trench. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the vest was on the ground, the shirt was dark with sweat, and Pike's boots were caked in the red clay that Tomas had taught Elias to use for plaster. Elias stood 10 feet away and did not help. He watched Pike dig the way Tomas had watched Elias stack his first crooked wall, with attention, patience, and the restraint of a man who understood that the labor was the lesson. Pike hit hardpan at 18 inches. He looked at Elias. "Deeper?" Pike said. "No. Fill it with gravel, fist-sized and smaller. Pack it tight." Pike filled the trench with gravel. He packed it with the flat of the shovel, the same motion Elias had learned from Tomas, the same motion Tomas had learned from 30 years of adobe repair. The gravel compressed into the trench like teeth settling into a jaw. When Pike finished, the trench was level, dense, and ready to shed any water that reached it. "Now the sacks," Elias said. Pike looked at the pile of empty sacks Elias had gathered, scavenged canvas and burlap, some from Nell's surplus, some from the freight team's discards, some sewn from scraps by Ruthie, whose small stitches were tighter than any adult's in the wash. Pike picked up a sack, held it open, and looked at the gravel bank where Elias had filled 930 sacks over the course of 6 weeks. "How many?" Pike said. "For a storeroom your size? 400, maybe 450. Pike's face did not change, but his hands tightened on the sack, and Elias saw the calculation happen behind Pike's eyes. 400 sacks at 4 to 6 minutes each, 30 hours of filling alone. Another 30 of laying, tamping, and wiring. A week of plaster work, 2 weeks minimum, working every hour the heat allowed. Pike began filling sacks. He was slow. His technique was wrong. He packed the edges first, the way Elias had before Tomas corrected him, and the sacks humped in the center and rolled when he tried to lay them. Elias watched 3 sacks go down crooked before he spoke. "The middle first," Elias said. "Strike the center. Let it flatten outward." Pike looked at him. The look contained everything Pike had said and done since June. Every dismissal, every locked sack, every whispered threat, compressed into a single moment where Lucian Pike had to accept instruction from the man he had tried to destroy. Pike struck the center of the sack. It flattened. He struck it again. It squared. He laid it on the gravel trench, and it sat flat and solid and correct. He did not thank Elias. He filled the next sack. The miners at the freight yard fence watched for an hour and then dispersed. By noon, the story had reached every tent in the wash. Pike was on his knees in the dirt, filling grain sacks with sand, building the thing he had called a grave. The story was not told with mockery. It was told with the quiet satisfaction of men who had been mocked themselves and now watched the mocker do the work. Pike built his storeroom in 11 days. Elias supervised. Nell provided plaster clay from her supply. Emmett helped with the roof, arrowweed matting, and canvas, the same design as every other structure in the wash. Ruthie counted sacks on her stone, chalk marks in rows of 5, and when Pike's total reached 412, she told him so, and Pike nodded at a 10-year-old girl the way he had never nodded at any man in the camp. The storeroom worked. Pike's flour stayed dry. His sugar stayed solid. His nails stayed clean. The interior held steady at 20 degrees below the shade temperature, day after day, storm after storm, through the last heat of October and into the cooler weeks of November. Pike never said the words. He never said, "I was wrong," or "you were right," or anything that a man who valued his pride above his comfort would recognize as concession. But he unlocked the depot sacks. Every empty sack behind the counter was available to any man who asked, free of charge, no credit attached. It was not generosity. It was the recognition that locked sacks were leverage, and leverage against a method that used garbage was a door locked against the wind. The wash changed that autumn in ways that were visible from the ridge above the freight yard. Where there had been canvas tents and thin board shacks scattered along the wash floor like debris from a flood, there were now circles. Small ones, large ones, half-finished ones with courses rising like the walls of abandoned forts. The circles had a rhythm to them: gravel trench, sack courses, wire between, plaster when the walls closed. From above, they looked like the footprints of some heavy animal walking through the camp, pressing its weight into the earth and leaving behind round, solid marks. By November, 7 structures used some version of Elias's method: his own cabin, Nell's storeroom, Dodd's cabin, Sung and Chen's cabin, now roofed and plastered, the interior divided by a hanging cloth into sleeping and living space. Ada Holt's half cabin, built against her husband's protests by Ada and 2 miners' wives who had decided that shade mattered more than marital consensus. Garrett's ugly, functional, crack-free cabin. And Pike's storeroom, tight plastered and grudgingly maintained by a man who checked his walls every morning the way he checked his ledger, with attention and without affection. Not every structure was good. Ada's wall was 2.5 feet thick in one section where she had run short of sacks, and Elias told her the thin section would fail in the next serious heat. She added sacks that week, packing them against the outside face and plastering over them, an ugly repair that worked. Garrett's roof leaked at the junction between the canvas and the wall, and Elias showed him how to seal it with a thick bead of clay pressed into the gap and covered with a strip of canvas set in wet plaster. Dodd's plaster cracked every 2 weeks and needed reapplication. Elias suspected his clay source was too sandy and walked with him to the yellow clay deposit above the old cattle fence, a mile away, where the clay was denser and more durable. These repairs were not failures of the method. They were the method. Earthen walls required maintenance the way canvas tents required patching, and timber walls required recalking. The difference was that the materials for maintenance, clay, ash, brush fiber, water, labor, cost nothing. A man who maintained his wall owed nobody. A man who replaced a warped board owed Pike. Elias taught the maintenance with the same insistence he taught the construction. Replaster after every storm. Check the drainage trench monthly. Read the cracks. If the wall talks, listen. If you do not understand what it is saying, find someone who does. He refused to build for anyone who would not learn. He turned away 2 miners who wanted to pay him to construct their shelter while they worked their claims. "I will not build a wall for a man who cannot fix it," Elias said. "When I am gone, the wall stays. The wall has to belong to the man inside it. It was Tomas's philosophy, spoken in Elias's voice. The craft had to live in the hands of the person who depended on it. Knowledge that existed in only one man died when that man died. Knowledge that existed in a dozen hands survived everything. Nell Tamsen and Elias Martin did not court. Courting implied a leisure neither of them possessed, and a formality neither of them valued. What happened between them was simpler and harder than courtship. They worked beside each other day after day, and the work revealed who they were in ways that conversation never could. Nell mixed plaster. She learned the clay-ash fiber ratio from Elias and improved it, adding a small measure of calciumite powder she scraped from a mineral deposit near the spring, which hardened the plaster surface and made it more resistant to wind erosion. Elias watched her test the improved mix on a section of her storeroom wall and said nothing for a long time. "That is better than mine," he said finally. "That is because I pay attention to the wall instead of arguing with Pike," Nell said. They built 3 cooling rooms together that November, one for water storage, one for food, one for sick miners during heat. The 3rd room was Nell's idea. During the heat wave, Kells and Raleigh and Emmett had all ended up on the floor of Elias's cabin because there was no other cool space in the wash. If another heat wave came, and it would come next June or July or August, as certain as the sun, the cabin would not hold everyone who needed shelter. A dedicated cooling room, larger than the cabin, open to anyone in crisis, could save lives that the cabin alone could not. They built it together. 16-foot interior, 3-foot walls, 2 doors on opposite sides for cross ventilation, a double-layered roof with a gap between the canvas and the sand cap that acted as a buffer. It was the largest sand sack structure in the wash, and it took 21 days. Elias, Nell, Emmett, Ruthie, Dodd, and Ada Holt filled and laid 1,600 sacks. The community room, as Nell called it, could hold 12 people lying down or 20 sitting. On its first day with the doors sealed and the windows shuttered, the interior read 73 degrees when the shade outside read 102. Nell stood inside the community room with her hand on the wall and her eyes closed. She did not say anything tender. She said, "The south plaster is too thin. We should add a coat before December." Elias said, "I know." They replastered the south face together that afternoon, Nell mixing and Elias applying, working in a rhythm that did not require words. Ruthie sat in the doorway and watched them, and what she saw, though she would not have had language for it at 10 years old, was 2 people building something from the same materials they used to build walls: patience, attention, labor, and the willingness to fix what cracked. Ruthie began sleeping in Nell's kitchen tent 3 nights a week. Not because she was told to, but because Nell's tent was where the food was, and the food was where Ruthie felt safest. Nell did not ask Elias's permission. She set a bedroll beside Emmett's cot and told Ruthie she could stay whenever she liked. Elias said nothing because nothing needed to be said. By December, Nell and Elias shared accounts. By January, they shared meals. By February, they shared the cabin. Nell's cot moved against the east wall where Tomas had leaned during the heat wave. Ruthie slept on the packed floor between them and drew chalk circles on the wall above her bedroll, circles inside circles, walls within walls. They did not discuss marriage until March, when a circuit preacher stopped at the wash to water his horse and asked if anyone needed services. Elias looked at Nell. Nell looked at Elias. The look lasted 3 seconds and contained 6 months of plaster and gravel and broth and sacks. "We might," Nell said. The preacher married them beside the community room, with Ruthie holding a creosote branch as a bouquet, because there were no flowers in the wash, and Ruthie had decided that the branch smelled better than anything that grew in the valley. Emmett served as witness. Dodd stood in the back. Sung and May and Chen stood to one side, and May had tied a red cloth around a stone as a gift, because red meant luck and stone meant permanence, and May understood what this family was building even if she could not say it in English. Pike did not attend, but the next morning, Elias found a tin of coffee on the cabin doorstep. Good coffee, not the burnt chicory the Wash usually drank. There was no note. There did not need to be. The months compressed the way months do when work fills them to the edges. Elias improved the designs through the second summer. Thicker west walls, 4 feet instead of 3, on structures that faced the worst afternoon sun. Lower doors, because hot air stayed higher and a low door admitted less of it. Whitewashed mud exteriors, because white reflected more sunlight than the natural brown, and the walls absorbed less heat to begin with. Deeper roof overhangs on the south and west faces. Small opposing vents, high and low, built into the wall itself rather than punched through canvas. And a formalized night cooling routine that he taught to every household. Open everything 1 hour after sunset. Close everything 1 hour before dawn, and never argue with the schedule. The improvements came from testing, not theory. Each change was tried on one wall and measured before it was applied to others. The whitewash was Nell's experiment. She mixed lime from a calcite deposit with water and brush applied it to the south face of the community room. The interior temperature dropped 2 degrees at peak hour. 2 degrees was not dramatic. Over a 10-day heat wave, 2 degrees of less accumulation meant the walls started each morning cooler, and the night flushing worked within a wider margin. Elias taught by making people test for themselves. He would not tell a man that whitewash worked. He would tell the man to whitewash one wall and leave the other bare and compare the plaster temperature with the back of his hand at noon. When the man felt the difference, cool plaster on the white side, warm plaster on the brown side. The lesson was in his hands, not in Elias's words. The second summer came and the heat returned. 112, 115, 118 on the worst day in late July. The Wash endured it differently than the first summer. 7 occupied sand sack structures held their interiors below 82 degrees. 3 canvas tents collapsed. 2 board shacks were abandoned by their owners, who spent the worst days in the community room. No one died. Emmett did not collapse. Ruthie did not faint. Kells, whose board shack had nearly killed him the previous August, slept on the community room floor for 5 nights and emerged each morning complaining about the hard ground, but breathing without difficulty. Nell served cold meals from the storeroom through the worst days. The food was clean. The water was cool. The beans she had stored in May were still firm in August. She fed 14 people from a storeroom that cost nothing but labor, clay, and 400 sacks of sand. Elias Marden never became rich. The claim paid modestly. He found enough silver in the hillside above the Wash to cover the assessment work and produce a small surplus, also enough to buy supplies through Pike's depot without credit, enough to keep Brindle fed and shod, enough to set aside a few dollars each month in a tin can buried beneath the cabin floor. The tin can was Nell's idea. She did not trust banks, shelves, or Lucian Pike's lockbox. She trusted packed earth and a lid that sealed. His wealth was not silver. His wealth was the thing he could do that no one else in the Wash had been able to do before he arrived: build shelter from materials the desert provided for free. Men came to him before building anything that was meant to stand, not just sand sack structures, any structure. They asked about drainage. They asked about foundations. They asked about shade and orientation and the direction a door should face. Elias answered every question with the same patience Tomas had shown him, and when the question was beyond his knowledge, he said so. "I do not know." he told a miner who asked about building a 2-story structure with sand sacks. I have never built higher than 7 feet. I think the weight would require buttressing I do not understand. Ask a mason if you can find one. Honesty about limits was the last thing Tomas had taught him, though Tomas had never said it explicitly. Tomas had simply never claimed to know more than he knew. He had said, "I do not know about roof trusses, about 2-story walls, about anything beyond the single-story earthen construction he had spent his life repairing." The phrase was not weakness. It was the mark of a man whose knowledge was real, because real knowledge has edges, and a man who knows where his edges are can be trusted inside them. Ruthie grew. She turned 11 in the cabin, 12 in the community room. Nell baked a salt flour cake on the stove, and Emmett gave her a new piece of chalk, thick and white, the best chalk available at Pike's counter. She drew on everything: walls, stones, the flat floor of the community room. She drew circles within circles, plans for buildings that did not yet exist, windows placed where she thought the breeze would enter, doors that faced north. At 13, she taught a new miner's daughter how to tamp sacks. The daughter was 7 and could barely lift the board. Ruthie held the board with her, and they tamped together, 2 girls striking the center of a grain sack filled with desert sand in a wash, where men had once laughed at the idea. At 14, Ruthie left for Mojave for schooling. Nell arranged it. A freighter's wife was traveling to the railhead and agreed to bring Ruthie to a family that took boarding students. Elias walked with Ruthie to the edge of the wash on the morning she left. He did not give a speech. He handed her a small flat stone with a chalk circle drawn on it, a circle with a square inside, the same symbol she had scratched on Tomas's grave marker. "Remember what the wall knows," Elias said. "The heavy thing wins. The slow thing outlasts." Ruthie put the stone in her valise beside the thermometer she had packed, a new glass thermometer Nell had traded for at the depot, better than the cracked one Tomas had provided. She kissed her father's cracked hands and climbed onto the freight wagon and did not look back, because Ruthie had learned from Elias that looking back was something you did after you arrived, not while you were leaving. The years in the wash were not a story of triumph. They were a story of maintenance. Walls cracked and were replastered. Roofs sagged and were reshored. Drainage trenches silted and were redug. Plaster washed and was reapplied. The sand sack structures did not endure because they were permanent. They endured because the people inside them understood that permanence was not a material property. It was a practice. A wall maintained was a wall that stood. A wall neglected was a pile of sand with ambition. Elias maintained his cabin for 9 years. He replastered after every storm. He replaced the roof canvas twice, once when a windstorm tore a seam, once when the fabric simply wore through from sun and sand and time. He added a second room in the 3rd year, a storage space for tools and food, attached to the south side of the cabin, built with the same method but with thicker walls and Nell's improved lime calcite plaster. The addition took 14 days, and Nell filled half the sacks herself, working in the early morning and late afternoon, her arms brown and ropey from 3 years of desert labor. In the 5th year, a new family arrived in the wash, a man named Tipton, his wife, and 3 children. They had nothing. Less than nothing. They owed a teamster for the ride from Mojave and had no prospect of work. Elias built a cabin with them in 12 days. It was his fastest build. By the 5th year, he knew every shortcut, every material substitution, every technique that saved time without sacrificing thickness. The cabin was small, 10 feet across, 3-foot walls, a low door, 2 vents, but it held 68 degrees at noon on a day when the shade was 109, and Tipton's 3 children slept on the packed floor that night without waking once. In the 7th year, Nell got sick. Not the desert sickness, not heat, not bad water, not the slow decline of a body dried by sun and wind. A fever that came from inside and did not leave. She worked through it for 2 weeks before Elias made her stop. She lay in the cabin on the cot against the east wall, Tomas's wall, she'd always called it, and listened to the wash through the open windows while Elias mixed plaster outside, and Emmett, now 21 and running the boarding operation alone, brought her broth every evening the way Nell had once brought broth for Ruthie. Nell recovered. The fever broke after 3 weeks, and she emerged from the cabin thinner and older and no less precise about plaster composition. Her first act was to check the community room walls, where she found a horizontal crack on the north face that had appeared during her illness. Horizontal, she said. The courses are shifting. I saw it, Elias said. You saw it and did not fix it? I was busy keeping you alive. She looked at him. The look contained the same thing their entire relationship contained, the knowledge that walls and people required the same attention, and that neglecting either one was something neither of them would tolerate. They fixed the crack together that afternoon. Ruthie came back during one August heat spell in the second summer after she left. She was 16, taller, sunburned from the freight wagon ride, carrying a valise that was heavier than the one she had left with. She walked into the cabin without knocking. It was her cabin, her walls, her chalk marks still visible near the door where she had tracked the shade line before the walls went up. She set the valise on the floor and opened it. Inside, beneath her clothes and her books, and the flat stone with the chalk circle, was a thermometer. Not the cracked one Tomas had given them, not the traded one Nell had sent her away with. A new one, precise, in a brass case with markings down to the half degree. She'd bought it in Mojave with money saved from tutoring younger students. She hung it on the north wall beside the old one. She read both. The old thermometer said 77. The new one said 76.5. Close enough, Elias said. Not close enough, Ruthie said. A half degree matters when you are teaching someone the difference between a wall that works and a wall that almost works. She sounded like Tomas. She sounded like the man she had watched die in this wash, whose lessons she had absorbed through her skin the way the walls absorbed heat, slowly, deeply, and permanently. Ruthie stayed for 3 weeks. She helped replaster the community room. She taught 2 new families the night flushing routine. She measured every structure in the wash with her brass thermometer and wrote the readings in a notebook she kept in her valise. She was not a builder. She was a keeper of records, a measurer of margins, the person who could tell you that Dodd's cabin ran 3 degrees warmer than her father's, because Dodd's Ramada had shifted in a windstorm and no longer shaded the full west face. When she left again, she took the notebook with her. The measurements stayed in the wash, in the walls, in the hands of the people who built and maintained them. But the numbers, the precise half-degree accurate numbers that proved what sand and labor and patience could do against a desert that killed by speed, those numbers rode in Ruthie's valise toward whatever life she was building beyond the wash. Elias lived out his later years near the same wash, not as a famous inventor, but as a man people fetched before building anything meant to stand. He was not old when the years caught him. The desert aged men faster than calendars could measure, and Elias had filled sacks and tamped walls and mixed plaster and dug trenches in 100-degree heat for the better part of a decade. His hands were permanently cracked. His back ached in the mornings. His knees complained on the walk to the gravel bank. He did not stop working. He slowed down. He taught more and built less. He supervised Emmett's construction of a second boarding structure, saw sand-sack walls with Nell's lime calcite plaster and Ruthie's recommended vent placement. He advised a group of borax workers who wanted to build a community kitchen with thick walls to keep the interior cool during cooking hours. He walked every drainage trench in the wash once a month, checking silt levels and gravel density, the way Tomas had checked the trench around Nell's storeroom on the day he died. Nell stayed beside him. She ran the boarding operation, now housed in sand sack walls instead of canvas, and served meals from a kitchen whose storeroom never rose above 78 degrees in the worst heat. She improved the plaster mix twice more, each time testing on a single wall section and measuring before applying the change to others. Her final mix, while clay, ash, chopped fiber, lime calcite, and a small measure of calciumite powder, lasted 6 months between applications instead of 2. She wrote the recipe on the inside of the storeroom door so anyone could read it. There were 17 sand sack structures in the wash the year Elias turned 45. Some were crude, some were ugly. One had been abandoned after its owner left for Mojave and was slowly returning to sand as the plaster weathered and the sackcloth rotted. All of them were cooler than the thin shanties they replaced. All of them had been built by the hands that lived inside them. And all of them carried, in their thick walls and gravel trenches and wire courses and clay plaster, the knowledge of a Sonoran adobe man who had walked into a camp and recognized correct instinct failing for lack of craft. By the next summer, Ruthie returned once more with her thermometer in her valise. She was 18. She measured every standing structure. She recorded the numbers. She noted which walls had been maintained and which had not. She noted which plaster had held and which had cracked. She noted which drainage trenches were clear and which had silted. She wrote it all down in the notebook that no one in the wash could read, but everyone in the wash trusted, because Ruthie's numbers did not lie, and Ruthie's numbers said what the walls were saying to anyone patient enough to listen. She found Elias patching the cabin's south face, the same face that had lost plaster in the first thunderstorm, the same face that took the worst sun, the same face that required attention every season because every season the desert tested it, and every season Elias answered. She stood beside him and watched him press mud into a crack with his thumb, the way Tomas had pressed plaster against the wall on the first day he arrived. His hands were older now. The cracks in his skin matched the cracks in the plaster. The wall and the man were aging at the same rate, maintained by the same stubbornness, eroded by the same forces, repaired by the same hands. "It is still standing," Ruthie said. "It is still maintained," Elias said. "That is not the same thing." She knew. She had always known. The wall did not stand because it was strong. It stood because someone understood what it needed and provided it before the need became a failure. That was the lesson. Not sand, not sacks. Not wire or plaster or ramadas or night flushing. The lesson was attention. The lesson was maintenance. The lesson was the heavy thing wins and the slow thing outlasts, and the thing that is cared for endures. A house made of dirt owes rent to the first rain. That is what Lucian Pike said on a June afternoon when the desert was 108 degrees in the shade and a man with $11.40 was stacking grain sacks in a circle while his daughter counted chalk marks on a stone. The rain came. It came more than once. It came hard and fast, and it tested every sack and every seam and every foot of plaster Elias and Nell and Tomas and Dodd and Sung and May and Ada and Garrett and Emmett and Ruthie and even Lucian Pike had pressed into those walls. The walls paid the rent. They paid it with clay and ash and fiber and labor, materials that cost nothing and meant everything, applied by hands that understood what the desert demanded because those hands had built the walls themselves. Inside the cabin, the air was dark and still. The chalk marks near the door, Ruthie's marks, drawn when she was 10, showing where the shade had stopped before the walls went up, were faded but visible, a record of the line between shelter and exposure, between living and waiting to die. The thermometer on the north wall read 76 degrees on a day when the shade outside pressed past 112. The windows threw their small rectangles of light across the packed floor. The plaster was scarred and patched and scarred again, a surface that recorded every storm and every repair in layers of earth and time. Elias pressed a fresh handful of mud into a crack on the west wall, while evening air moved through both small windows. His hands were rough and split and certain. The mud gripped the wall. The wall held the heat. The heat moved slowly through 3 feet of sand and gravel and patience, and the desert, which had given him almost nothing but sand, watched a man make even that hold.